All right, so short reviews for July 5th. And this is sort of a sample from the middle of the month. July 14th is a release date for all six of these releases. And for now, I'm just sticking to six so I can work on other things throughout the day. And these are more or less curated just for general interest. I don't think that anything here is necessarily album of the month quality, but certainly records that will catch the ears of people from all different walks of life, and a couple of brutal death metal records in here because that's what I've been listening to lately. So uh, the first up is Pressure from Radiant Knife. This is a Lafayette, Louisiana-based progressive sludge metal band, and one which really much deals in riff and rhythm. That's the focus of the band. These guys love to play live. They're quite a good band, and it's a duo who, again, riff and rhythm is their what they do, and they're particularly good at it. This is a very virtuosic level of performance, and they still have that sort of stony sense of what's interesting. Like the way I put it, there's a little bit of Helmet, there's a little bit of like Mastodon, a little bit of Lightning Bolt in what they do, but we could call it progressive sludge metal just for the way that it is tightly syncopated. It is there's a lot of groove to everything they do, and they have those sort of noisy alt rocking touch to everything they do, which is usually focused around some kind of melody or a declarative anthemic push. So they explored the sound more on their last two EPs. But they've really focused on like what they did with the body more so than they did with the Ghost on this record. It really is front to back, just action, and I think that's kind of the best side of the band anyway. So I liked it quite a bit. If you're familiar with the band, this is kind of just one of their more energetic releases. It really just doesn't stop pushing throughout. So definitely a recommended release for this month. Dawn of Eternal Suffering is the debut full length from Nuclear Remains, and any band on Maggot Stomp is pushed pretty quickly into the spotlight for not only performing live but also putting out a record maybe sooner than they should in some respects. So this is certainly a record that is influenced by classic brutal death metal, and they point to Dying Fetus pretty directly. And I would say if you're a fan of like purification through violence, you'll get this record right away. There is that sound, but once you press play, you're really going to be thinking of Brodekin. I mean that the snare is certainly there, and they're blasting away at it. I think that Brodekin only used snare on one of their records that sounded like that, and the band Dissevered, which is from Laos, I think. Their record, their first LP, uses it this way, which is just in every song all the time, pinging all away, and that it's a meme. It is good. I like it, but that's not what is interesting about this record. Really, what it is, it's great to see younger people taking an interest in authentic early brutal death metal. The before we press into the 2000s fully, and that means that there's definitely the feeling of skinless here between the samples and the more emergent kind of thrashing riffs and all that. If you're a fan of Horror of Horrors and their first album, Sounds of the Eerie, there is that level of production value, sound, and sort of thumping early brutal death metal feeling. And that's really all there is to this record. I think that there's a lot of throwaway riffs. I think there's a lot of sluggish, kind of boring guitar work, and it feels like a demo level recording in a lot of ways. And that's appropriate. I think that's kind of what they're going for. But it promises a little bit more than it delivers in terms of just finesse or like what's impressive about this beyond its throwback sound. Now, as someone who's a little bit older, I appreciate the throwback sound because this is the underground death metal that I knew back in the early to mid '90s in terms of what was just crazy and out there and fucked up, and they get me there in that sense. But a little bit this sound has been refined upon, and I think they could just tighten up their performances enough to where like they're invoking that sound but they're not sounding sloppy, if that makes sense. So that's still a good record. So I'm not sure what to say about Prism, the this collaboration between Sutek Hexen and Funerary Call, which are basically blackened ambient or you know, ambient artists from the United States and Canada, respectively. And this record is an hour, just about an hour of subterranean sounds, vocal shrieks, sort of goblin-esque vocalization, a couple of guitar notes here and there, and mostly uh, deeper subterranean sounds that are blackened and interesting enough. But I'm not really sure either what I'm listening to or what it's supposed to produce in me, other than very interesting background noise. So I hate to say it that way because I like what Sutek Hexen does, but I feel like it's often more active than this and a little bit more just creatively incensed in terms of varietal sounds. And I feel like a lot of these songs really center around strange vocal experiments or interjections, which variously work and variously don't. So an interesting record, and one I'd still recommend in terms of expanding your general, just like what you're listening to, variety, but not the best Sutek Hexen release for me. Wrapped in Suffering is the third full length from Encephalic, an Andalusian or southern Spanish, southern coastal Spanish brutal death metal band who uh, basically their first two records were a little bit more of the moment. They were just a little bit more of a modern sort of gimmicky brutal death metal sound, which was touching upon slam. It was touching upon just like uh, again, brutal death metal of the moment and maybe of the last 10, 15 years. Whereas the third record, to me, feels a little bit more of a pushback to like what Suffocation had brought to brutal death metal around 2004 or so with Souls of Deny, which was a sense of intricate rhythm that is certainly elaborated upon on this record. And they aren't necessarily blasting it like all the way back with like what Disavowed were doing on their first two records. Um, but they do kind of sound like that. There's a riff style that certainly dances around a similar melody throughout, and it'll be an easier nuance to pick up with if you've been listening to brutal death metal quite that long, because this does feel like it steps back to the good stuff, the early to mid 2000s brutal death metal of the underground, MySpace, CDRs, all that stuff. And that's kind of where like, that was a scene that I was quite involved in. And I think that the guitar style is really the great focus of this record. I think that there's a little bit of like that putrid pile style like tremolo picking. There's, again, some of the very clear Suffocation influence. And for me, it was just entertaining throughout. It's a very polished record compared to their last few. I think the drumming is quite a bit better than on the last. I don't know if it's programmed or not, but it's quite solid in terms of fitting each composition and creating that effect. And in general, I just had a good time with this record. Looking for solid brutal death metal, this is a great choice. So there's been this huge influx of Italian stoner doom metal over the last several years, and Witchsnake is a good example of a band that sort of just picked it up and started playing, and came up with a couple of, first a demo for the B side of this release, which is three songs, which are a little bit more jammed. It's a fuzzier Electric Wizard style sound, which has just sort of a jam session feeling. There's a little bit of a stoner rock push to some of it. There's a psychedelic rock influence on all of their work, but the side A is kind of the reason to show up for this record. It is less loose, it's a little bit tightened in terms of its tongue, in terms of its songwriting, but in general, they touch upon psychedelic doom metal and the spaced out feeling of it on that first side, which just leads to more memorable songs, even if they do drift off as often as they feel like it. Um, So if you're looking for something that is sort of Electric Wizard adjacent in terms of, effects on the vocals and a fuzzier guitar tone, this will give you that feeling, but it has a little bit more of an emergent feeling to it. It feels like it's you're watching a jam band in some sense in that style. So, not a lot of deep notes on this record. I feel like this is a start for the band. It's certainly a debut, but they, like a lot of bands that have sort of picked up this style in the last few years, they have a ways to go with it to make it something I haven't heard yet. So, I connected with it enough to enjoy it, but it's not quite. It's not blowing my mind at all. Position Momentum is the second full length from London-based black and hardcore slash post-metal band Caligram, who they return with a little bit more of a spark in their sound, a little bit more aggressive overall on this album, but it is still very much a post-metal album from a black and hardcore band, if that makes sense. Uh, the vocals are probably my lowest note for this thing. I think that they are incessant and flat, not particularly emotional beyond the lyrics themselves, and just kind of never stop spouting off throughout the full thing. And the problem is they're interrupting music which is of a different tone than the lyrical delivery. The music is actually fairly interesting in terms of merging black metal with post metal in a way that understands post metal better than a lot of black metal bands do. So you certainly get that sort of post hardcore, post metal sound uh, from the with sort of impersonation of black metal wrapped around it. And I think that they do manage a lot of great songs on here in terms of the compositions, but the vocals sort of tear that apart and sort of exist in the periphery. They're sort of tuneless. Uh, there's no real diction or cadence that makes any real sense in terms of music, and maybe that's a hardcore stylistic point that a lot of people will like, not for me in particular. So it's not a bad album. I think if you're interested in the post metal, post hardcore kind of black and hardcore um, merging with black metal and trying to understand that world, this is an interesting record in that sense. And there's a lot of very interesting sort of uh, play with tonality and sort of a sorrowful sound that sort of leaks throughout this whole thing. I just think, the vocals just kind of ruin it, and basically the record just kind of goes nowhere after the first several songs for my taste. So maybe you'll feel differently, and maybe you're more of a fan of this kind of thing. So check it out and see if it is your stuff.